Hello, my name's Ian Peterman. I'm CEO and founder of Peterman Design Firm. And today we're going to answer the question, how much does it cost to make a prototype? And, you know, not to without the answer to the end, the short answer is it's a really wide window of cost. But some examples for you would be, something that's relatively simple, no electronics. We're talking about something like sunglasses or um, wallets, more accessory type products, simple products that don't have any electronics in it, and they have a part count of under let's say about 20 pieces. I mean, there's no more than 20 individual parts that have to be made and assembled in order to create it. With those kind of prototypes, we see in a range from, a couple $100 if it's mostly off-shelf parts. Even some 3D printed parts can be relatively cheap depending on the scale, all the way up to several $1,000s. Just depends on the quantity and size. Size is actually a huge part of the cost in prototyping. So when you're talking about prototyping, use my pen example again. Prototype pen, it's not going to be that big. 3D print this, it will probably cost a few $100s tops to 3D print pieces, put it together, and make a little pen prototype. But if we're looking at, let's say something a little bit bigger, maybe laptop size, or even chair that I'm sitting in right now. It may seem really big because it takes up a seemingly large amount of space, but if you break down a chair, it's actually a bunch of smaller pieces that have been put together. So, the seat, the back, center post, legs, those are all relatively moderate sized parts. They're nothing really big. We're not talking about furniture. So say the couch behind me, prototype that couch is going to take a significant amount more than my chair, even though size wise, volume, when you look at it, the apparent volume is, this is maybe twice the size of this. That's going to take a lot more material than just twice as much as the chair. So size wise, your scale of size is going to really matter, and there's ways to get around that. So when designing a car, you don't start by creating a full scale model of a car or even a full scale prototype design. You start with a smaller scale. So your prototypes, you can scale them down. They don't always have to be the exact production size. So we've done that with things like even consider electronics, even things that you have to hold. If it's easier to shrink it down just to get an idea of the form, then shrink it down, make it smaller. Don't worry about the scale necessarily at the beginning. Obviously, production, prototyping, and things like that is going to have to be done at scale. Your user testing models are going to have to be at the actual scale. But especially form models, and that way you can reduce costs. You can sometimes cut your cost to prototype just an idea of something by 70-80% just by shrinking it down a little bit. So keep that in mind when you're costing out your prototyping. You can scale things down, and we do that with clients. I've done that quite a bit, shrinking something down, making it a little bit cheaper. Also makes it easier to ship. I don't really see shipping a whole car prototype to someone, but I can make a little model, a 1/32 model, a 1/16, pretty common scale ranges. And so think about that when you're prototyping. That will help reduce the cost. Now, if we're talking about as soon as you start getting electronics into your prototypes can quickly double in cost. Depending on what you're trying to do. If it is something that is relatively simple, let's say to give the example of an alarm clock, that's probably an off shelf. You're probably not going to do a huge amount. And I'm talking about like an analog, it's not it's not as smart. You're not, let's say has a motor in it or a small LCD display. It's not Bluetooth enabled. It's not a speaker. It doesn't have all those bells and whistles attached to it. And so every system that you add, you could be looking at another 1,000 to several thousand per system for a prototype. So you want to add Bluetooth in, great. Now you have to code your system in order to handle the Bluetooth so it actually does something. And that's where electronics can get very expensive very quickly because there's so many systems. Now, prototyping, we can get away with a lot of things and reduce costs in prototyping by using off-shelf components. So instead of trying to buy get a custom made device that has custom Bluetooth system, you buy an off-shelf system, you use off-shelf software, you connect it all, and you just let it basically work on its own. And so that helps with the pricing, but oftentimes, once you get into that, the prototypes can be thousands to tens of thousands of dollars for electronics, and that's at the low end. Prototyping something like a laptop, a tablet, smart device, you could be looking at quite a bit more just because of just the so many additional services and expertise is needed to bring in. You aren't just having a mechanical designer design a physical form or an industrial designer, mechanical engineer, whoever's doing that. It's not just one person. Like one person can design the form. That's great. But typically you need, once you get into electronics, you want to have somebody else. Now you're at least a 2-person team. Now you want to add smart device. You want to add coding, Bluetooth enabled, different connectivity parts to it. Now you're integrating multiple systems. Now you probably need a software person. So you have a hardware person, you have an electronics person, you have a software person. Now you have 3 people just to make, let's say a smart alarm clock. You have at least 3 people now involved in order to make those systems all be developed and tested and build a prototype for. And so now you can also be looking at multiple vendors, right? You're one person, they'll 3D print or they'll make your physical enclosure for your device, right? And you have one person that creates a software, and you have a third party that creates the electronic prototype. And sometimes you can get off-shelf parts and make it work that way, but you're going to at least do some breadboarding or something like that. And so your cost for electronics easily begins to double and triple because now you're using 2 to 3 at least different times more skill sets than you are for something that is not electronic in any way. And so that's why those pieces, when you move out of just physical product, that is no electronics. If I know electronics, I mean there's no motor controllers, there's nothing in there that requires any electronics really. At least no moving parts. You can get away with a lamp, flip a switch, turn it on and off. Those are off-shelf parts. Those can easily do mechanical. Doesn't get too complicated. So, if you were going to do prototype this little lamp here, nothing too crazy, capacitive, touch, a light bulb, shade, body, plugs in. That's not really going to cost a lot. Like that lamp, for example, would probably cost $2,000 prototype tops, and that's including the electronics portion that's buying off shelf parts and all that. And you might even be able to get 2 prototypes out of $2,000, just depending on what manufacturing process you get and if you can get a discount for getting multiple parts made. So, and that's something to keep aware as well. One prototype sometimes can be so close in price to 5 prototypes in terms of part cost because you get volume discount. So that can also help with costing. If you need 5, just get 5 up front if the price is really close, because you at least have 5 to play with, break, test, whatever you need to do. It really allows you to have a little bit more flexibility in your prototype and what you can do with it. And then the other costs. So if we're talking about, you want to develop, if you want to develop your own smartphone, you're going to be looking at easily a couple $100,000 in prototyping, just because you're going to have to prototype a lot and you're going to have to do a lot of coding. If you want your own operating system, that's a whole nother layer. So, with all of this, the question of, well, how much does prototyping cost? You can see I've just gone through a bunch of different variables just in talking about, how to cost reduce in a prototyping. And I've seen prototypes that they were literally $15 for one. And I've seen prototypes where the prototype cost several $100,000 for one. And that's just one to get made, able to work. That's, I've looked at and worked with medical devices. A couple $100,000 isn't crazy at all, because you end up selling, like, the device will in production will cost maybe $30,000, $50,000. A lot of times your prototype cost is anywhere between 10 and 1,000 times your actual production cost. So, that's a good way to kind of estimate your range, which gives you a very wide range, of course. But, smaller, less complicated products, you're going to be looking at the 10x range. And, for much more complicated, it obviously does not cost $100,000 to buy this phone, but it costs about 1,000 to buy a top of the line, 600 for second, not the flagship model, but second model. And you're going to be looking at, quite a bit of money to be put into prototyping. So you're looking at more like 100-time range to 1,000-time range in prototyping costs, and even covering development costs as well. So yeah, hopefully that gives you an idea. And honestly, research and getting quotes is part of the process. So, something, you'll have a ballpark, and you always start with a ballpark. It's something that if you talk to someone, they say, oh, well, I guarantee you I'll prototype your new device. You want a new smartphone, I promise that I will get you a whole prototype, and I can give you a quote on the exact prototype cost, and you haven't finalized design or engineering, and they can tell you what it's going to take to go into production. One of two things: they've either done it, your specific product, so many times that they're going to be able to copy and paste from other designs that use common parts. They just have basically a large catalog of parts that they just pull from, which means pretty much very, very little to nothing of your product will be custom, because that's the only way you're able to do it and have an exact number. Is you can go through your part catalog and go, oh, well, we need these 10 components from here. We need these 15 over here. You add up those totals, and there you go. Here's the cost of prototype. Otherwise, if you have just an idea and somebody gives you that, you haven't actually designed it, I would guarantee you 9 times out of 10, they're not being honest at all. They're just blowing a number and saying it in order to get you to say yes to working with them, because it's almost impossible to estimate that without actually having done your exact product multiple times. Or something that we do is going through and doing a feasibility study, or a gap analysis, and that involves talking to manufacturers, giving generalized specs of a product to manufacturers, to prototypers, and that's how you can start getting a number together. And if you don't have all of those specs defined, your quote and estimate's only going to be as good as your information that you give someone. And so if you have no information and you're getting a number, likely it's probably not an accurate number. And so something that we do when I work with clients and they want to know a budget, we give a range, and we basically say, here's our bucket of money. We're going to want at least X X number of dollars set aside for prototyping. We don't know exactly how much it's going to cost. And until we have gone through concepting, until we've gone through user analysis, until we've designed it, until we have created drawings and we know exactly what we're prototyping and which type of prototype. Is it a form prototype? Is it a fit prototype? Is it cosmetic? Is it functional? Is it for your investors? Is it for user testing? There's so many different types of prototyping, so many reasons to prototype. Those hard costs, we won't even know until we know what the product is and what the release strategy is and how you're going to test it and use it. So we don't provide quotes on prototyping, and we tell all of our clients we're going to have a bucket. We're going to start with that, and we can give some good ballpark. We give a good sized bucket. We make sure that we look at past projects that were similar, and we go, okay, well, we think that it's going to cost this, and then we add some to it because we don't want to surprise people. We try to avoid. We'd rather go, we're going to need $50,000 and only spend 30. That's a way better thing than saying, oh, it's only going to cost $30,000, and then, oh, but we need this extra thing because we made a change or we didn't realize, and we avoid that whole, underbidding and change ordering client to death. And we just create a bucket that's big enough to actually encompass it and go from there. And so it's going to be an estimate. It's going to be a ballpark. Its whole point is to get close. And so when you ask that question of someone, what's it going to cost? I'll give a range. If you ask me, I'll give you a range. Like, it's going to cost $50,000 to $100,000 to design and prototype this, but I won't know till we get going. And so just be aware, anybody that's guaranteeing you a prototype cost, one of two things. They're either overcharging you so much that they don't care. They're like, oh, well, it doesn't matter. We're going to charge you $150,000 and we think it's only going to cost 20 grand, but we have such a huge margin of buffer in our cost that if it costs 5 times as much to do, we still make money. Or they're going to end up change ordering you and they're going to say, oh, it's $20,000. And then after the 20 grand is used, they're going to go, oh, well, it's another 10 grand and we'll have it for you. And then it's another $7,000. And then you just go and eventually you get to $50,000 and you've been delayed because the first scope only went to a certain amount of hours in a certain time. And so prototyping is an ambiguous part. And unless you have fully defined product, you're not going to get an accurate number. And so just be aware of that and be okay with it. You got to be okay with there being ambiguity. It's product development. If there is a perfect formula, and I think we have a really good formula with our firm, but until you input enough information into the formula, it won't output any numbers that will be perfectly accurate. And so that's why it's all custom. It's all very tailored towards your exact product, and it's okay. Walk down the process, figure it out, and set budgets, and you work from there. So hopefully that gives you some information around prototyping, the cost of prototyping, and how you're going to be able to walk down that path and when you can figure out your actual prototype cost. All right, thanks.